In the early years of World War II, the Luftwaffe believed there was no opponent in the sky they could not defeat. Their confidence had been forged in the crucible of the Spanish Civil War, in the lightning conquest of Poland, and in the blistering battles over France. German pilots, trained under ruthless standards and sharpened by relentless combat, considered themselves the elite of the world's air forces. They confronted Soviet aircraft in the east, British fighters over the Channel, and American bombers in the west, and survived encounters that seemed impossible. But even with all their experience, nothing prepared them for the day they encountered America's P-47 Thunderbolt, a machine so rugged, so unbreakable, and so shockingly durable that it rewrote everything they thought they knew about aerial combat. When German pilots first saw the Thunderbolt, they laughed. How could they not? The aircraft was enormous. It looked like a flying milk can or an overweight metal barrel. It lacked the sleek lines of the Bf-109, the sharp aggression of the FW-190, or the famously elegant silhouette of the Spitfire. The P-47 appeared clumsy, slow, and simply too heavy to be taken seriously. Some Luftwaffe pilots joked that it must need a runway as long as Berlin to take off. Others said it would crash under its own weight, but this arrogance would not last long, because mocking the Thunderbolt was easy, until German pilots actually fought it. The first real engagements were filled with disbelief. German pilots attacked Thunderbolts the same way they attacked every other Allied fighter, with precise cannon bursts targeting the engine and wings. Against a Spitfire, even a short burst of 20mm fire tore off the wing surface. Against a Soviet fighter like the Yak-1 or Lei GG-3, a few shells ripped the cockpit apart. But against the Thunderbolt, something strange happened. The shells didn't work. They hit. They exploded. But the American aircraft simply kept flying. German pilots were shocked to see chunks of metal fly off the Thunderbolt. And yet the machine stayed airborne, climbing, diving, and fighting as if the hits were nothing more than raindrops. Reports poured into Luftwaffe command. The new American fighter is heavily armored. Our cannon rounds do not bring it down. The aircraft is too tough to kill. These weren't excuses. These were the honest words of hardened veterans. They had never seen a fighter that could take this much punishment and return home. And worst of all, the Thunderbolt wasn't just surviving. It was winning. The secret was the Thunderbolt's enormous radial engine, the Pratt & Whitney R2800, one of the most durable engines in the world. Liquid-cooled engines like the Bf-109's Daimler-Benz were vulnerable. One hit to the coolant system and the German fighter overheated in seconds, forcing the pilot to bail out. But the P-47's radial engine could take direct cannon hits without catastrophic loss. It didn't leak. It didn't overheat. It didn't fail easily. German pilots were stunned to see Thunderbolts with cylinders blown open, oil leaking and smoke pouring from the engine, yet somehow still climbing into the sky. But engine durability was only the beginning. The Thunderbolt's entire structure was built like a flying tank. Armour plates protected the pilot from every angle. Reinforced spars kept the wings intact even when riddled with holes. Fuel tanks were self-sealing and incredibly resistant to fire, and the airframe was so over-engineered that it withstood catastrophic damage. German pilots weren't just fighting an aircraft. They were fighting a machine built to endure the apocalypse. The psychological effect on German fighter groups was immediate. At first, they engaged Thunderbolts with confidence, but after several encounters where P-47s returned home with more holes than aluminium, German pilots became cautious. They knew they needed to hit a Thunderbolt multiple times, perfectly and at close range, something extremely dangerous in the middle of combat. The P-47's 8.50 caliber machine guns made closing the distance a gamble. Each Thunderbolt carried firepower so intense it shredded aircraft in seconds. A German pilot making a close-range attack risked flying directly into a wall of lead. Thunderbolt pilots weren't just flying tough aircraft, they were flying aggressive. They dove into German formations with a fearlessness rarely seen. In a dive, the Thunderbolt was unmatched. Its enormous weight transformed into raw speed, allowing it to reach terrifying velocities German fighters simply couldn't follow. Many Bf-109 pilots tried to chase Thunderbolts into dives only to feel their aircraft shake violently as compressibility forces overwhelmed their control surfaces. Some blacked out, some broke their wings, and some never pulled up again. Meanwhile, the Thunderbolt remained stable at speeds that shattered German aircraft. It dove like a falling boulder and zoomed back into the fight with crushing force. German pilots quickly learned if a Thunderbolt dove, chasing it was suicide. Then came the bomber escort missions, the moment when the Thunderbolt reshaped the entire air war over Europe. Before long-range escorts existed, German fighters tore into American bomber formations with devastating efficiency. B-17 crews called it the death run. But once Thunderbolts arrived, everything changed. Now the bombers were surrounded by armored guardians. The Luftwaffe tried its usual tactics, diving from above in coordinated waves. But the Thunderbolts intercepted them. German pilots found themselves outnumbered, outgunned, and unable to break through. Again and again, Thunderbolts absorbed brutal damage, saved the bombers, and returned home, riddled with holes. Ground crews saw P-47s land with cylinders missing, wings shredded, tails cracked, and fuel lines punctured. Yet every single one somehow brought its pilot back alive. The legend of the unkillable Thunderbolt spread across German airfields. Pilots whispered stories of P-47s taking hits that should have destroyed them instantly. They talked about engines blown apart yet still running, about wings peppered with cannon holes yet holding together, about pilots walking away from crashes that should have been fatal. Fear crept into the Luftwaffe's ranks. No one admitted it openly, but every German pilot knew. Fighting Thunderbolts was different. You couldn't rely on the usual weaknesses. You couldn't expect your guns to finish the job. You couldn't assume the American would fall when hit. The Thunderbolt broke the rules of dogfighting, and that terrified them. This was the moment German pilots realized the war in the sky was shifting. The days when the Luftwaffe ruled were ending. The Americans had unleashed a monster, and it was only getting stronger. As 1943 turned into 1944, the presence of the P-47 Thunderbolt grew across the European theater, and with every new engagement, the Luftwaffe's fear of the aircraft deepened. German pilots, who once charged boldly into battle, now hesitated before committing to an attack. They had watched too many Thunderbolts survive hits that would have obliterated a Bf-109. They had seen too many dogfights end with the P-47 diving away at impossible speeds, leaving German aircraft shaking on the edge of structural collapse. They had fired too many cannon shells into Thunderbolts, only to see them continue climbing toward the bombers they were built to protect. The Americans understood the psychological effect the Thunderbolt had on the Luftwaffe, and they used it mercilessly. Thunderbolt squadrons were trained to hunt German fighters with relentless aggression. They flew high-altitude sweeps, dove on enemy formations with overwhelming firepower, and pressed attacks even when outnumbered. With its rugged airframe and 8 heavy machine guns, the P-47 became a predator of the skies. It didn't matter if the Luftwaffe used hit-and-run attacks, vertical maneuvers, or defensive spirals. The Thunderbolt found a way to counter every tactic. German pilots began referring to the Thunderbolt as der fliegende Backstein, the flying brick. But despite the mockery, they quietly admitted the truth. It was one of the deadliest fighters they had ever faced. The Thunderbolt's ability to absorb damage created a new kind of enemy, one that could not be intimidated or easily destroyed, and the Americans flying it knew exactly how strong their aircraft was. Many P-47 pilots returned from missions laughing in disbelief as they inspected the holes in their wings or counted the flak fragments lodged in their fuselage. They had survived storms of anti-aircraft fire that should have torn them apart. Then the Thunderbolt's role expanded again. It became one of the most feared ground attack aircraft of the war. Using its enormous weight, rugged construction, and powerful engine, the P-47 dove onto German convoys, tanks, rail lines, and troop formations with devastating effect. It carried bombs, rockets, and hundreds of rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. A single Thunderbolt could rip open an armored column, destroy a locomotive, or silence anti-aircraft guns within seconds. And because it was so tough, it survived anti-aircraft fire that would have downed any other fighter bomber. German troops on the ground soon learned to fear the distinctive roar of the Thunderbolt's radial engine. Tanks were left smoldering, convoys scattered, and artillery positions obliterated. German soldiers wrote in their diaries that the P-47 seemed invincible, that it shrugged off ground fire, and that no matter how much ammunition they poured into it, the aircraft simply refused to fall. The Luftwaffe, already battered by overwhelming American production, could not replace its losses. Every German fighter that crashed was a blow they could not afford. Meanwhile, the United States produced Thunderbolts in staggering numbers. If one was damaged, it was repaired. If one was lost, another took its place, and every new P-47 model was faster, higher climbing, and better armed than the last. German commanders finally realized something horrifying. They were not fighting a single aircraft. They were fighting an industrial machine behind it. The Thunderbolt became a symbol of American power, a flying representation of a nation that could outbuild, outgun, and outlast the Reich. And German pilots, no matter how skilled, could not stop it. Late in the war, German veterans spoke openly about their fear of the Thunderbolt. Some admitted they avoided engaging it whenever possible. Others said they preferred to fight Spitfires or Mustangs, because at least those aircraft could be damaged more reliably. But the Thunderbolt, it felt immortal. Many Luftwaffe pilots described the same moment, firing a perfect burst into a P-47, watching the shells hit home, waiting for the American fighter to explode, and then seeing it emerge from the smoke, turning back toward them with guns blazing. Thunderbolt pilots, protected by armor and flying the toughest fighter in the sky, were emboldened. They became more aggressive, more confident, and more fearless. They stormed through German formations, broke up intercept attempts, and forced the Luftwaffe onto the defensive. They escorted bombers deep into the heart of Germany, shielded ground troops during the Allied advance, and struck targets with merciless precision. The Thunderbolt was everywhere, and it survived everything. By 1945, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Fuel shortages grounded many units, inexperienced pilots replaced the veterans who had been lost, and every time the Germans tried to mount a defense, Thunderbolts were there, climbing above them, diving past them, escorting bombers overhead, or hammering their positions on the ground. When the war finally ended, German pilots spoke with a mixture of frustration and respect about the Thunderbolt. They admitted it was the one aircraft they could never figure out. They had learned the weaknesses of every Allied fighter, but not this one. They had watched it survive damage that should have destroyed it. They had shot at it until their guns were empty, only to watch it fly home, and they had seen it transform the air war in a way no other fighter had.
Brave warrior, you've come far, but the dark forest is treacherous. Trust your instincts, and remember, the magic lies within your sword. Forge ahead, and let the light guide you.
The Thunderbolt became a legend not because it was the fastest or the most agile, but because it was unbeatable in the one category that mattered most in war: survival. It absorbed punishment, protected its pilots, delivered massive firepower, and returned home again and again. The Luftwaffe never found a reliable way to defeat it. The Americans had built a fighter that embodied the overwhelming industrial and technological power of the United States. And for German pilots, the Thunderbolt was a terrifying realization. The era of German dominance in the skies was over. They were now facing a machine and a nation that they could not overcome. Even decades after the war, surviving Luftwaffe aces admitted the truth. The P-47 Thunderbolt shocked them, broke their confidence, and forced them to confront an enemy aircraft that seemed impossible to kill. It was the fighter that survived everything, and it changed the air war forever.